Coming up, a new era with no dominant power.
What we're witnessing is one of those moments in history, one of those rare moments in history, in which the globe's center of gravity is starting to move.
Georgetown professor Charles Kupchan talks about the rise of the developing world and what the Western powers can do to stay relevant during this global turning point. It's just ahead on Global Ethics Forum.
Today we have the pleasure of listening to one of our country's leading international scholars, Charles Kupchan. Professor Kupchan can always be depended upon to offer a clear and distinctive voice to any discussion about foreign affairs, especially now as he weighs in on the future of the emerging world order and how best to manage global change. Our speaker began to explore these issues almost a decade ago, first in his widely acclaimed book, The End of the America Era, and now in How Enemies Become Friends. In many ways, these are both companion pieces to No One's World, The West, the Rising Rest, and the Coming Global Turn, which he will be discussing shortly.
If you step back from the headlines of the newspaper of the last few years and say, what's the undercurrent? What's the flow of events of the last few years? I think you'd come to the conclusion that in our part of the world, and by that I mean the West, North America, Europe, and let's sneak Japan in there, although not geographically part of the West. Japan has geopolitically been part of the West since World War II. That this zone has been going through a rough patch. Our economies have slowed. We are facing debt crises, and we're not sure how to get out of them. And perhaps most worryingly, our political systems have gummed up, seized up, and they don't seem as fleet-footed as they were during the balance of the 20th century. If you pan out to other parts of the world, what we call the developing world, in some ways you would see the opposite. They are enjoying unprecedented rates of economic growth. They have a new wind in their sails in a political sense. They are fast ascending the pecking order. They are beginning to organize themselves, the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. They don't know exactly what they want in terms of world order, but they know what they don't want, and that is a world in which they continue to feel as if they are operating in the shadow of Western power. What we're witnessing is one of those moments in history, one of those rare moments in history, in which the globe's center of gravity is starting to move. The last time that happened was about 300 years ago. Let's pick 1800 as a nice round date to demarcate the time at which the West pulled ahead of the rest. If we went back to, say, 1600 or 1700 and took a snapshot of the distribution of power in the world, we would see that it was broadly diffused. The Holy Romans in the West, next door to the Ottomans, next door to the Mughals, the Qing to their east, and finally the Tokugawa shogunate. And each of those different imperial zones had a different view about how to order itself, how to deal with politics, how to deal with commerce, and power was broadly diffused across those main imperial zones. But if then we took a snapshot in 1800, we would have noticed that something very interesting had happened, and that is that one zone in the West, in the North and the West, had pulled ahead of the rest. Northern Europe, Northwestern Europe, over the course of the 1700s and then further over the course of the 1800s, started to dominate the globe. The pendulum swung from Asia and the Mesopotamian Valley, north and west to Europe, and then it spread across the Atlantic to North America. And for the last 200 years, that zone, North America, in partnership with Western Europe, has been at the front of history. It has enjoyed ideological dominance, material dominance, and it was able to send out its tentacles to most of the world. By the end of the 19th century, 90% of the world was either a European colony or a former European colony. So there really was a period in which one relatively small zone of the world was able to extend its dominance and its ideological primacy to other parts of the world. This moment that we're entering, this new swing of the pendulum, is going to lead to a world where no one will be dominant. It won't be a new American century, it won't be a Chinese century, it won't be an Asian century, it will be no one's world. The challenge for those of us who think about and practice world politics is how to manage a world that is globalized, interdependent, smushed together, but is no longer anchored by the West's material and ideological primacy. The West still represents 50% of global GDP, but that is not going to last very long. By 2025, the World Bank predicts that we will be in a three-currency world. The dollar will no longer be dominant. It'll be roughly a third of global reserves in the dollar, a third in the euro, a third in the Chinese renminbi. By 2032, the BRICS, the main developing countries of today, are expected to equal in GDP today's G7 advanced industrialized countries. And what I think is in some ways the most impressive piece of data in this respect, today in 2012, actually 2010 because the tables have already turned a little bit, 4 of the top 5 economies in the world are still Western. There's only one developing country that makes the cut, and that's China. In 40 years, of the top 5 economies, only one Western country is going to make the cut, and that's the United States. The rest of those countries in the top 5, at the top 5 pecking order, will all be from what is today the developing world. So you look at that data, the internationalization of the renminbi and the euro, a world in which today's developing countries equal today's developed countries in not much more than 10 years. A world in which China is expected to surpass the United States as the world-leading economy in 2027 and then pull rapidly ahead. By 2040 to 2050, it will be double the size of the United States in terms of GDP. What are some of the key differences between Chinese models of development and the Western path? Well, for starters, China's middle class, at least for now, is not the vanguard of political change. And that's because the Chinese state, unlike the European states, is smart enough to open its doors to the middle class. When the middle class in Europe emerged, the monarch and the pope got together to hold it back, to beat it down, to clamp down on it. And that's why they ended up overturning those institutions. The Chinese state is smarter than the Holy Roman state. The Chinese state, beginning in 1979 with Deng Xiaoping and the decision to let businessmen join the Communist Party, has essentially been co-opting the middle class ever since Chinese began to privatize the economy about 30, 40 years ago. And what that means is that you now have a big middle class in China, but it's not a middle class that is doing the same thing that our middle class did. It is a middle class that is essentially a defender of the status quo and an investor in state capitalism. In that respect, yes, China is becoming a middle-class society, but no, its middle class is not having the same political impact as the middle class of Europe and the middle class of the United States did. Now, it may be that sometime down the road, when China continues to modernize, continues to develop, continues to urbanize, you might get a middle class sizable enough to push for democracy. I actually think that will probably happen. But when is that going to happen? A long time from now. And so the operative question in my mind is China going to be a liberal democracy by the time it becomes a world power? And the answer is no. It will be a world power long before it is a liberal democracy. And I would also point out that in the world that we live in today, we no longer need change and entrepreneurship to come from below as we did during the rise of the West, because we live in a globalized world in which huge amounts of capital and services and goods are sloshing through the global economy on a daily basis. And that has meant that state capitalism has its advantages. What are those advantages? Mainly keeping a hand on the tiller. And I don't think it's accidental that China and other countries that have control over their currencies and over their capital accounts and over state-owned businesses have actually ridden out the global financial crisis better than countries that are more open and more free. And that confounds what we believed. We were originally told that globalization will advantage countries that are most liberalized and most free. I don't think that that's actually proving to be the case. Russia, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, there are lots of other state capitalist economies out there. I also think that they have enormous staying power. Let me quickly pan to the Middle East. You may be thinking, well, this guy Kupchan, he doesn't know what he's talking about because the Middle East is finally breaking America's way. What are the Arab uprising? What's the Arab Spring but a reconfirmation that the Western version of how to organize society is winning out? We were told Islam and democracy are incompatible, not so fast. Well, I think there is truth to that argument, and that one cannot only be uplifted by what has happened in the Middle East over the last couple of years. There is no doubt that a call for dignity, a call for accountability, a call for people to be respected is part of what is toppling regimes across the region. But I also think that the nature of modernity that we are going to see emerge as the Arab Spring unfolds and the nature of modernity that we have crafted in the West are going to be very different in a critical respect. And that is, when we modernized, we effectively pushed the church out of politics. We became the West, in some respects, post-Reformation. In the Middle East, I think we're going to see the opposite. The more participatory politics spreads in the region, the more Islam is going to come back into political life. And that's because there has never been a division between the mosque and the state in the Muslim world. There has never been even a vocabulary in Arabic that connotes the sacred and the secular. There was never a split between the Pope and the Emperor because the Caliph was both. The secular leader and the religious leader merged into one. Islam is a religion of faith and law. Christianity is a religion of faith only. And it was only when the Pope and the Emperor were united with each other in alliance that the religious authorities had secular power. That's not true in the Muslim world. And so what I think we have seen in the Arab Spring and what we have seen in every country in that part of the world that has held elections is that political Islam is the winner. In Iran, Iraq, Lebanon, Palestinian Authority, Tunisia, Egypt, every country where you've had some kind of participatory election, it is the Islamists that have generally won. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. All I'm saying is it's different. And if we believe that what we're witnessing in the Middle East is the emergence of a region that is going to sort of track the Western model of development, I think we need to think again. And I would point to Turkey as a prime example of a country that is getting more modern, more industrialized, its middle class is growing by the day, and its long run of secular politics has come to an end. That is, I think, a kind of clear data point that suggests that as modernization moves through the Middle East, what we're going to get is a different kind of modernity than the brand of modernity that emerged in the Western world. Finally, let me take a quick look elsewhere, India and Brazil, because India and Brazil are liberal democracies. They appear to be emerging as countries that may, to some extent, be closer to us geopolitically than to emerging powers that are not liberal democracies. But I think here, too, it would be a mistake for us to assume that when we wake up in 2025 or 2030, that we can count on the Brazils and the Indias of the world to side with us and to dock their boats in our harbor rather than to hedge their bets and to play with us sometimes and to play with the emerging powers other times. And I think that the fact that, number one, Brazil and India are emerging as liberal states, as developed states, not as middle-class societies, but as societies in which the vast majority of their populations are rural and urban poor, means that we're seeing a left-wing populism that is a very different kind of politics than that practiced in the West. And that means that they are more skittish about open markets than most Western countries. And it also makes them more uneasy to throw their lot in geopolitically with us. And that's why I think if you look at Indian foreign policy or Brazilian foreign policy, you will not see a picture that suggests that their commitment to democracy means that they are aligning geopolitically with the West. Brazil and India vote with the United States in the UN Security Council less than 25% of the time. Brazil took the lead in recognizing the Palestinians, again, breaking with the United States. India right now is in the midst of dispatching a trade mission to Iran at the very moment that strangling Iran's economy is probably the #1 foreign policy goal of the United States. And so I think the first challenge for Americans and Europeans and Japanese is to figure out how to be competitive in the 21st century, how to play the game that the Chinese and the Brazilians and the Turks and others are playing. And I think we need to be smarter and shrewder and realize that business as usual will not do. And think about investment, education, training. China is building high-speed rail and bridges and aircraft and rail network, and all of those infrastructure in our country are falling apart. And for starters, we need to have somebody in Washington who is thinking about the long term and who's doing long-range strategic economic planning. That's what the other guys are doing. And unless we get in the game, I fear that they are going to clean our clock. And I think the same goes for Japanese and for Europeans. We can be competitive. I know that we will rebound from this moment. I'm not someone who thinks that the United States is in decline. I think the United States is a remarkably resilient country. But we need the right decisions and we need the right politics to get us out of the mess. And then I think the West will be able to manage this transition and provide the leadership that will be necessary. Finally, I think that we should recognize that the version of modernity that we have so successfully crafted over the last 200 years is our version of modernity. Some may embrace it, some may not. But I think the key rule of thumb for the West as it goes into this global turn is to respect and be respectful of alternative versions about how to organize life. I think that we should stand firm in defense of human rights, that we should stand firm against regimes like the Syrian regime or the Sudanese regime that abuse and exploit their people. But around the world, there are many countries that are not liberal democracies that are nonetheless responsible governments, that have brought their people out of poverty, that are working to improve the lives of their people. And I think that in a world in which power is diffusing as fast as it is, we have no choice but to be more tolerant and more acceptant of countries that may not want to look like us, but nonetheless are prepared to work with us and to govern responsibly. And that in no way, I think, diminishes who we are. It in no way diminishes our ability to stay who we are. But I think managing no one's world is going to be a tall feat. And in many respects, the West today needs to do for the rest of the world what it did for itself 200 or 300 years ago. And that is, number one, accept pluralism, accept that different people have different approaches to how to run their lives. That was key to allowing Protestants and Catholics to live together. And the second thing that we did that was magical was to accept the diffusion of power, to allow power to move out from monarchs towards people, the middle class and the working class. And I think that's the trick that we need to do today, to recognize that pluralism can do for the world what it did for us, to recognize and accept that power is diffusing around the world, and to shape it and not resist it. The biggest mistake that I think we can do is to pretend either that this global turn is not happening or to pretend that it is happening, but it doesn't matter because in the end, everyone wants to look like us. If we assume that, we're going to get it wrong. If we get ahead of the curve and move toward the more pluralistic world that I think would be reflective of the West's own values, I think we have a fighting chance of actually getting it right. Thank you very much.
You've essentially, at least in my view, talked about a global rebalancing of power, more countries on the Security Council, and production, more widgets from China, fewer widgets from the United States. Isn't there a third element of rebalancing that needs to be considered, and that's a global rebalancing of consumption? And doesn't that present a very difficult problem for the United States, Western Europe, and Japan?
It's an excellent question. And I think that the imbalances in consumption and in investment are to some extent fueled by globalization. Right? And that's because we are able to get away with living beyond our means because we live in a world in which there's a lot of flow of capital and other countries are willing to buy our debt and allow us to live beyond our means. China and Germany and others have, in some respects, been too focused on export-led growth, don't have enough domestic demand, and that comes ultimately at our expense because it's harder for us to export our goods and therefore to grow by selling goods abroad. I do think that one of the issues that can be addressed in a forum like the G20 or in other venues in which emerging powers and Western powers come together is just this issue. How to get a global rebalancing, how to get more consumption in countries like China. And I actually think it is in the interests of the Chinese government to increase the value of the renminbi, because that increases the value, the purchasing power of the average Chinese. And probably the greatest threat to Chinese political stability is the inequality that exists within the country. But it's very hard for them to overcome the vested interests of party members who own export companies. And I think little by little you will see the Chinese move towards a revaluation of their currency, and that will help us, but we need to lean hard on that issue.
You've argued eloquently for multiculturalism and for tolerance of other political ideologies. My question has to do with where do ethics and morality fit in? For example, how do we deal with slavery in other countries? How do we deal with other countries where half the population is behind a veil and kept home? How do we deal with other economies where people work 6-day work weeks, 12 hours a day, and where children are working?
I think it's a very good question, particularly given the location of our debate tonight. I think it's not an easy question to answer. And that's because I believe that the United States needs to retain a strong moral component to its foreign policy, and that the United States has been a moral compass for the world since its emergence as a global power at the end of the 19th century. But I think we need to find a happy medium. We need to find a happy medium between demonstrating respect for and a willingness to work with countries, even if we don't agree with their nature of governance, while at the same time being unabashed in expressing our disapproval for violations of what we would consider to be moral standards of behavior. I also think that if we are somewhat more tolerant and somewhat more ready to work with regimes with whom we have some discomfort, we will do much better at building coalitions against those regimes that are most flagrant in violating the human rights that you have enumerated. And I think that in some ways would give us much more leverage and much more moral persuasion than where we are now, where we alienate the Russians and we alienate the Chinese and we alienate a lot of other regimes, and we make it harder for us to do what we need to do. One final comment. I think the United States, during much of its history, was somewhat more humble about its ability to shape other countries and believe that our best way to do it was through example and encouragement and inducement. And I think over the last few decades, we have lost, to some extent, our sense of proportion and our ability to draw limits. And I worry that what Iraq and Afghanistan suggested is that we came to believe that we could become the fixer of last resort, and that we could go into countries very different culturally, very different socioeconomically, and turn them into stable democracies. That's a bridge too far. It is a black hole for the United States. And that's why I think we need to find a happy medium.
Well, as the world turns, I'm just so glad that we have you thinking about this, and I hope those in Washington are listening to you, and you will be invited back again. So thank you very much.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.